Hello everyone, this is an introductory InDesign tutorial teaching you the basics about Adobe InDesign. When you open InDesign, it will look something like this. You can either create a new document or open a previous document. I'll go ahead and walk through creating a new document. So you hit New, and this new document window pops up and it asks you to insert a page size and just preset some things before you start working. So I'm going to select a letter page size, which is an 8.5 by 11, and I'm going to select the vertical orientation. If you wanted to choose something that was different, there's some other preloaded sizes in here. I'm just going to stick with letter because that's easy to print and also works well on a screen when exported with two pages side by side. I'm going to leave the rest of these settings here as they are. That you can always change them later, but they're good defaults. So I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to bring up a new document. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to save it. And so what's really important when you're working in InDesign is finding a location on your computer where all of your InDesign images and files would be saved. So when you're working on a portfolio, it's good to have a folder called Portfolio where you can house the actual InDesign document as well as images and drawings and photographs of models for your studio and skills work. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this in my InDesign lecture folder that I've already created. Please do something similar when you're saving your portfolio. So I'm going to hit save. And if I want to change the name, I would type in portfolio and hit save. So now I have my portfolio saved, and just to give you a quick walkthrough of InDesign, you've probably used this a little bit already, but on the left are toolbars. Is a toolbar with different tools that we'll use throughout this demonstration. On the right are panels, like pages, text, character, paragraph. Those are all useful panels to have open. If your screen doesn't look quite like this, if you go up to Window and you click Workspace, so again, Window, Workspace, and hit Essentials, and that'll pull up just the essential tools and panels that you'll need. Along the top is this bar that changes as we're using different tools, so you get options as you're clicking, for example, the text box tool. Notice that the top bar changed and gave me some more options for that specific tool itself. So keep an eye on that as you're using the different tools in InDesign. So when you create a new file, your rulers may or may not be on. These are the rulers up at the top and along the side. That helps you understand how big the actual image or the content is. If you hit Command R, it opens and closes the rulers. If you right click on the ruler, you can set like what increment you want to measure with. I prefer measuring in inches. That is how my brain works. So if you right click, you can select inches. You can select different increments if you prefer. So again, Command R and then right clicking to select the units. The next thing that's good to create is a page. So on the right hand side, the Pages menu looks like a piece of paper. If you click that, it opens up this list of all the pages in your document. Notice I have one page now. If I hit this Create New Page button, it looks like a little square at the bottom, I can make new pages, and these are pages in my document. There's this thing called master pages. If you're using a newer version of InDesign, these are called parent pages. What a parent page or master page does is anything that you place on that page will show up on all the pages in your document. So, for example, a text box that says your name and portfolio might be something that you want small on every page. Maybe you have page numbers or something that can also be useful on a master page, but anything that you put on a master page will show up on every page in your portfolio. So notice, on the right side master page, I have Whitehurst Portfolio, and then when I click into my actual document, so here's page 1 of my document, notice that Whitehurst Portfolio is there, and I can no longer select it. So it's a good way of, if you have something that does repeat That's a good place to put it, again, on the master page. If I want that on both sides, I can simply copy and paste that and move it over to the other page. So now when I go back in, notice that Whitehurst portfolio shows up on both sides. So that's how parent pages or master pages work. If you double click on one of those parent pages, it brings you to the page to edit it. Double clicking back on another page in the document brings you directly to that page. If you've made too many pages, you can delete a page by clicking on it and hitting the trash can. You can also click and drag a page down to a trash can to also delete. And then again, making new pages by clicking that button. So let's go ahead and place some images. So the next thing is how to place images. There's actually quite a few ways that you can do this in InDesign. I'll show you my preferred way is simply navigating to your image wherever it's saved. Again, I would highly recommend setting up a folder for your portfolio itself and moving the images into either a links folder or an images folder is fine. The way that InDesign works is that as I drag and drop this image into InDesign, it's remembering where I've pulled that from. So if I go to the link panel and I have this image selected, the name of my file, A Little Rain 3, very, very bad name, but name your file is better. But this is actually like pointing to a location on my computer where I've saved that link. So it's really important. It's not a big deal or the end of the world if you end up moving an image later, but if you move all of your images, it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So it's good to be organized. Like I said, make a folder called Portfolio and then put a folder inside of that with the word images or links and just keep getting the habit of locating copies of your work there. So just to show that again, I've found where that image is saved on my computer and I click and drag and drop it and then it comes up with this little window and I click again to place the image itself. Another way of inserting an image is to create a box, a window first, or a frame for the image first by clicking the rectangular frame tool or typing F. But if I click and drag, that makes a box that's just an empty box that won't print, but I could lay out a series of boxes in my portfolio first. Perhaps I'm using a grid. I'll show you how to use a grid in a moment. But I could create these boxes first and then go through the same process. Normally I like to click on the box that I've made and then I go back to my Finder window and I'll click and drag and drop and now that image will fit inside the box. And see how it's cropped kind of in a weird way? To fix that, if you click on the box itself, up at the top, again notice that this panel has changed slightly as I've been clicking around. Up at the top right there are these quick fitting tools. So I can click the one on the left and fill the frame proportionally, meaning that it's going to fit the width to the image, or I can fit the content proportionally, meaning I'm going to fit the whole image itself within the frame. It scales it automatically. So that's a quick way of scaling things to fit, and if you want to crop images or zoom in on certain aspects of your drawings or photographs that aren't necessarily the full size that you originally took, that works too. So if you double click inside of the box, notice that this orangish brown box appears. Let me zoom in so you can see that. That means that I'm scaling now the image itself. So I can hold Shift and then drag, and notice now that image moves within the frame that I've created. So I'm scaling the actual image itself, not the frame. And then if I hold Shift, I can move this thing around, or you don't have to hold Shift, you can move it. If you hold Shift, it moves it perpendicularly. But I can fit this now in the frame, so maybe I don't need all of that negative space that I had created originally, and I just want to crop in on the building that I've created itself, or the crane is kind of an interesting part. So maybe I want to zoom in even further and show just that building and get rid of the rest of the water I made when I made this image originally. You could do that. To scale the actual frame, you just make sure that you've clicked once and the blue rectangle appears. Again, you can hold Shift, and that will scale the frame proportionally. If you click and drag up, it moves it vertically, and vice versa. If you click and drag to the right, it scales it horizontally. So maybe, playing around with the fill buttons is very useful in the beginning, and then going back in and individually scaling can be useful by double clicking. It's important to note that those two arrows here are the selection tool arrows. So the white arrow allows you to select the image itself. The dark arrow selects frames, or like I said, you can double click and then you're inside the frame. The next thing that could be useful when laying out a portfolio is to work with a grid. I tend to use guides. These are called smart guides. If those aren't automatically on for you, you can go to View, Grids and Guides, and hit Smart Guides, which is Command U apparently. And so what that does is it shows me when I'm centered on a page, it shows me when I'm centered vertically or horizontally. It'll also show you when you're centered on another image, or see how that green line appeared, so I'm centering on the center of that box that I've created. So it gives you all these different options to center and align things. I like using smart guides, certainly, because it helps you to align without needing to rely on a rigid grid. A grid is also really useful, though, for when you're starting to lay out a portfolio, especially for the first time. Grids can be really useful in just keeping things clean. You can create a grid by making your own guides. So if I click and drag one of the rulers, I can pull guides across. If I click and drag on the top ruler, I can pull guides down. And I can set these things. I can select a grid or a guide that I've made, and I can tell it where I want it to go exactly on the page by typing up at the top. Like maybe I want one at exactly 2 inches, and it'll move that grid line. I can do the same thing. Notice that it's giving me hints like 4, so maybe I want this one exactly at 4, maybe I want this one exactly at 6. Again, you can type in to be sure. If you miss a little bit, you can select the grid line and then type in 6. So maybe you set up a grid based on your own math. I'm going to delete those by selecting and hitting delete. You can create grids that way. You can create things to align with that way. You can also turn the grid on. There is a grid built into InDesign. So if you go View at the top, View, Grids and Guides, Show Document Grid. Now I have this like very detailed grid that runs across the whole portfolio. And then if you go back to View, Grids and Guides, and then Snap to Document Grid. Now when I pull my windows or my frames, suddenly my frames start to snap to the grid lines themselves. So that's another way of using the grid. You can just snap to it by clicking and dragging, and then if you're laying out multiple images, you can just be sure that you're snapping to the same grid line and counting grid spaces in order to get equal spacing. So that's a way of doing it too, like allowing InDesign to show you how to snap. I'm going to go back to View, Grids, Guides, and I'm going to turn off Snap to Document Grid. Notice that Smart Guides doesn't work when you're snapping to Document Grid. InDesign just likes to have one thing, generally speaking, I'd say, that it's snapping to, and it doesn't like to have Smart Guides on while you're snapping for whatever reason. So I'm going to turn Snap to Document Grid off, View, Grids, Guides, and now notice that Smart Guides came back on, which is great. And then I'm just going to hide the document grid so you can more easily see what I'm doing. And I'm going to hit delete this frame by selecting it and hitting delete. So the next thing that is really useful when you're working on a portfolio is to add text. So I think thinking about how you want to describe projects is useful early on. I don't think you need paragraphs and paragraphs of text to explain projects, especially if they're simple. But having like a space dedicated for text as an introduction to a project, or somehow consistently laid out could be very helpful in working on a first portfolio. So to create a text box, you select the T on the left, it's the type tool, and you click and drag, and that draws the actual box you can type in. So you can type, I'm just gonna, for just as demonstration purposes, I'm just gonna fill this box with text. Just right click and hit fill with placeholder text for now, just so you can see an example. So I'll do that and pretend that I've written a nice little blurb about my project. And then I'm going to make another text box, and that'll be my title. So this project was called Lumi Home. And so now I'm going to change these to look a little bit nicer than just the normal sort of serif. This one defaulted to Minion Pro, but I want it to be a little bit more stylized than that. So I'm going to go up here and just sort through and pick kind of a different font. I like using fonts that are what are called sans serif, meaning without serifs. Serifs are the little like curly doohickeys at the end of a letter. So like the serif is how that L like curves out. That's a serif. I like sans serif fonts personally that don't have the sort of curving bits to them. Serif fonts, however, are easiest to read in most cases, I would say. So sometimes it's acceptable to like have a title that's maybe a sans serif font, and then maybe text, like you see that in a lot of books or textbooks, there's serifs on text. You could do that. I'm going to choose to just use like the same font. Maybe I'll make the title bold and make it bigger. You can change the size by clicking the arrow up and down. You can select a standard size, or you can type in any number you want. Bold, regular, italic, not all fonts have those options, but a lot of them do. I'm going to just use bold. This is the spacing between, I'll show you that in a minute, that's the spacing between lines. Like think like double space, single space, 1.5 space, that's that spacing, but you can control it more exactly by picking any point you want. It normally defaults to auto. I'm going to hit all caps. I think I like having my titles in all caps. And then I'm going to spread the letters out a little bit. So this is that option there. I'm just going to increase that so there's a little more space between the letters as a title. There's some other options if you want, like, you know, superscript, subscript. Strike through is an interesting one. I don't know why you would do that, but underline. I think typically just doing something simple like bolding. Sometimes people use italics or bold italics. That could be useful too. But keeping it simple and clean is my recommendation. And then I'm going to double click, I'm going to triple click actually, 1, 2, 3, and that selects the whole paragraph. I can hit Command A, and that'll select all the text. And that's where I'm just going to go, and I'm going to pick the same font. I'm just going to use the regular version instead of the all caps version. And maybe, you know, when you're writing yours, you'll probably have real paragraphs. Maybe I'll just use spaces like this when I'm, you know, typing. If you want to, you can left justify your text. There's other options like full, you know, you can use like sort of a justify, like the full width. I typically do some sort of justification with everything aligned on the left, but then having the text kind of fit toward the right-hand side as well. But those are the options, and that's on the left-hand side. Again, I can hit Command A to select everything inside the text box once I've clicked in it and change it that way. So that's text. I think I'll center that maybe on the page. And I'm gonna, this is a good hint. If you, on a text box, if you double click on like the bottom, what it does is it brings it all the way up to the last line of text you have, which is helpful, and then it's more easy to see how it centers on the page and can center more easily. So if you have a text box that's really big, if you double click on the bottom of it, it jumps it up so that you can more easily see the size. So maybe this is a pretty good start to a layout of a portfolio. A money shot, splashy image, on the left-hand side and some text on the right-hand side. And maybe I want this to be a little bit bigger. Or maybe I have another money shot that I'm not thinking of that I could kind of fill this page a little bit more fully. So maybe I'm doing like full bleed image on the left with text on the right. And maybe that's how I start my portfolio projects every time, potentially. So that's text boxes, sizing of text, as well as placing of images. We did grids and guides. A couple other quick tips. So if you go back up to the top and you hit View and you hit Display Performance, this is helpful. So sometimes when you get all of your images in a portfolio, they'll be really high quality images most of the time, and sometimes that'll slow you down a little bit. So you can choose under View, Display Performance, Fast Display, and what that does is it takes the images, all of the images in your portfolio, and turns them gray. So that way you can easily go through, if you're editing text or you're putting text in, it's useful. It just speeds things up pretty significantly. I'm often on typical display, which will still show me the image, but it'll show me a reduced quality version, so it's not quite as high resolution. And sometimes you can't even really tell the difference, frankly. I normally turn on high res display, or high quality display as it's called, when I'm trying to get a sense for exactly how non-pixelated, I guess I should say, an image is. The other thing under View that's useful, if you go View, up at the top, View, Screen Mode, Preview gets rid of all of the boxes, so you just preview what it might look like if your portfolio were printed or exported as a PDF. Presentation is a useful one, so View, Screen Mode, Presentation. That puts your portfolio sort of in presentation full screen mode, which can be helpful too when you're running through it or previewing what's happening. So that's View and Screen Mode. Let's go through the steps to exporting. So let's say you have finished your portfolio and you've laid out other images, keeping in mind size of image and layouts, keeping them fairly consistent from project to project. But let's say you've gone through all that. I would hit Save every once in a while. And then up at the top, if you go File, Export, it brings up, it's first asking you where do you want to save it. So I'm just going to save it just in the same, in my case, InDesign Lecture, but I'd probably save it in my portfolio folder if I were doing this for real. At the bottom it's asking, are you printing, are you interactive? I think what's important to understand is if you're planning to print a portfolio, as in literally print it at a printer, you want to be under print mode. If you're going to be emailing a portfolio or uploading it somewhere for potential employers to see, interactive mode is more appropriate. So I'm going to do interactive just to show you. For the purposes of this portfolio assignment, you can also use interactive mode. I'm going to hit Save. And then here is where, generally speaking, I think normally you're exporting all of the pages at once. If you wanted to export only a handful of pages, maybe perhaps for this assignment, you can do that and tell it specifically what pages you want to export. I'm just going to do all the pages for now, but if you knew I needed to export pages 6 through 10 for this project, you could. And then spreads is a way to export, if you wanted to export these two pages together so that they came up as one page when I viewed it on my screen, you could. So I might actually do that because I'm going to just view this on the screen, and I would like people to be able to see this image and this image, or this text, all at the same time. And you might do that for your whole portfolio. You could export individual pages as well, which would just be a single page. So I would get this as one page as well as that as one page. So I'm just going to hit spreads because I like the idea of seeing both pages together. And then under compression is where, so to print something, you really do want 300 ppi. I think for the purposes of viewing something on a screen, 150 is plenty. And then under JPEG quality, this is where if your portfolio gets really big, you can mess around with picking a lower quality. High is normally a good place to start, but medium can be certainly just just as good, especially when you're exporting and trying to get a file size to be pretty small. So I'm going to do medium 150 and leave compression at automatic, and then I'm going to hit export, and so it's going to think about it. Depending on how many pages you're exporting, it might take a little while. But then, so notice that I had a couple of those pages in the beginning that I didn't use, but now I have my PDF made, and I don't need all these other pages, so I can, in the PDF, make PDF if you have Adobe Acrobat Pro, which you should download if you pay for Adobe Creative Suite. Adobe Acrobat Pro is included, so make sure you download the Pro version instead of the free version, and you can just do more with Adobe Acrobat. So using Adobe Acrobat Pro, I'm just going to delete out these pages. I could have picked which pages to export out of InDesign, which would have been smart, but I'm just going to do it this way for now. So I'm going to hit save, and then if your portfolio, normally employers like portfolios to be 10 megabytes or less, which is actually a pretty small file size. Sometimes, especially if you have lots and lots of images sort of in a portfolio. So another thing you can do if exporting at that size isn't quite enough is you can reduce the file size by going in Acrobat Pro, going File, Save as Other. You can do Optimize PDF, and here's where you can reduce the compression further. So I could say try that at 150, 150, and then 150. For anything over 150, 150, 150. So that's just a trick. Hit OK. And then I'll ask you where you want to save it. So I'll just hit reduce and see if that gets us a smaller file size. So that's a trick for reducing things further if you end up exporting one day and your portfolio is bigger than you want it to be. I think for the purposes of this exercise, chances are you will be fine. But then that's really all there is to it. I think being sure that you export to a PDF and name your file appropriately before uploading are also important steps to this process. That is all I have for you today for Adobe InDesign.